Welcome. So, if you're taking an economics class, you already know that supply and demand is like the foundation of everything. But things get really interesting when the government steps in and decides a market price is just plain wrong. In this explainer, we're going to get into two super important concepts that add a layer of reality to that basic model: price controls and elasticity. And by the end, you'll see exactly how these ideas shape policies that affect every single one of us.
It really all boils down to this one simple but incredibly powerful question. I mean, you see it all the time, right? A government takes a look at the price of rent, or maybe gasoline, or wages, and decides, nope, that's too high for people, or that's way too low for workers. So they intervene. But what actually happens next? What are the ripple effects? Well, that's exactly what we're going to unpack together.
So here's how we're going to tackle this. First, a super quick refresher on how the market finds its natural balance. Then, we'll get into the two main ways governments intervene: price ceilings and price floors. After that, we'll introduce a brand new and honestly crucial tool for our analysis: elasticity. And finally, we'll see why that one single concept completely changes the game when you look at the real-world impact of these policies.
All right, let's dive into our first section, the Markets Balancing Act. See, before we can really break down any kind of government intervention, we first have to understand the starting point, what the market does when it's just left alone. And in economics, we call that starting point equilibrium.
Just picture a perfectly balanced scale. On one side, you've got everything sellers are willing to supply. On the other, you've got everything buyers want to buy. The market, all by itself, kind of magically finds that one single price where those two sides are perfectly equal. That's equilibrium. But, like we said, sometimes a government decides that this balanced price just isn't fair. Maybe it's way too high for buyers or painfully low for sellers, and that's the moment they decide to step in.
So that brings us to our second section and our first type of intervention: price ceilings. Let's imagine the government thinks the price of something, say apartment rentals, is just getting out of control for regular people. To try and help, they might put in something called a price ceiling.
And a price ceiling is exactly what it sounds like. It's a legal maximum, a lid on the price. A seller cannot legally charge you 1 penny more than that amount. The classic example you're going to see everywhere, and definitely in your econ classes, is rent control. That's where a city sets a maximum rent for apartments, all in an effort to keep housing affordable. Okay, now here is the absolute key, the one thing you have to remember. For a price ceiling to actually do anything, it has to be set below the natural market price. And when that happens, the result is pretty much instant and totally predictable. At this new, artificially low price, way more people want apartments than there are apartments available. Demand suddenly shoots past supply, and what you get is a shortage. But here's where it gets really interesting. What happens next? When you can't use price to decide who gets the scarce good, other weird things start to happen. You might see crazy long wait lists for those rent-controlled apartments, or maybe landlords who just stop bothering with repairs because, hey, they can't raise the rent anyway. You might even see illegal black markets pop up with secret side payments. The shortage doesn't just disappear, the market finds other ways to deal with it, and they're usually not very efficient or even fair.
Okay, so let's flip the script now and look at the total opposite in our third section, price floors. What if the government thinks a price is actually too low, that it's hurting producers or workers? This is where they might bring in a price floor. A price floor is the mirror image of a ceiling. It's a legal minimum price. Think of it as a safety net that the price is not allowed to fall below. And this is usually done to help the suppliers in a market, whether we're talking about farmers or workers.
Now, as you can see in this graph, for a price floor to really have an effect, to be binding, as economists say, it has to be set above the equilibrium price. At this new, higher price, producers get excited and want to supply a lot more of the product. But at that same high price, consumers want to buy less of it. So now, the amount being supplied is way bigger than the amount demanded, and the result is always a surplus.
And the most famous, most talked about price floor is, without a doubt, the minimum wage. In this case, the product is labor. We, the workers, are the suppliers, and companies are the ones who demand our labor. The wage is just the price. So, when the minimum wage is set above what the market would have naturally paid, the model shows that more people want to work for that higher wage than companies are willing to hire. And that surplus of labor? We have a much more common name for that: unemployment. And just like with shortages, these surpluses don't just sit there. They have to be dealt with. With agriculture, for example, governments have often had to buy up mountains of excess corn or wheat just to keep prices high for farmers. Sometimes they'll even pay farmers not to grow anything at all. And in the labor market, that surplus means that some people who really want a job at that minimum wage just can't find one.
So we've got a pretty clear rule down, right? Price ceilings cause shortages, and price floors cause surpluses. But that is not the whole story, not even close. To really think like an economist, you have to ask the next question. Okay, but how big are those shortages and surpluses? And answering that question brings us to our fourth section and the unbelievably important idea of the elasticity factor.
Just think about it for a second. Does a 10% hike in the minimum wage cause the exact same amount of job loss in every single city for every single industry? Of course not. Does putting rent control in San Francisco create the same housing shortage as it would in a small town? No way. And the reason for that difference lies in a simple idea. How sensitive are buyers and sellers to a change in price?
Elasticity is really just a fancy word for responsiveness or sensitivity. In plain English, it's just asking, when the price of something changes, how much do people react? Do their buying and selling habits change a lot or just a little bit? That's all elasticity is measuring, but it is the absolute key to understanding the size of the effects we've been talking about.
You can think of it as a spectrum. If something is elastic, it means people are super responsive. A small price change will cause a huge change in how much they buy. On the other end, you have inelastic. This means people aren't very responsive at all. The price can go up, but they'll keep buying pretty much the same amount. Think about things you absolutely need, like gasoline to get to work or life-saving medication.
All right, time for our last section, and this is where we put it all together. Now, this might sound a little theoretical, but I promise you, understanding why elasticity changes everything is the key to seeing how economics plays out in the real world. Let's look at some examples to make this crystal clear.
Okay, take a look at these two graphs. In both scenarios, we have the exact same reduction in the supply of oil. But look at the results. On the left, demand is elastic. Maybe people can easily take the train or work from home. That supply shock causes just a small price increase because people can just switch. But now look at the graph on the right, where demand is inelastic. Everyone has to drive their car to work, no other options. That exact same supply shock causes a massive price spike. People have no choice but to pay.
And this works for the supply side too. Imagine some new health trend makes everyone stop drinking coffee, so demand drops. Now look at the top graph, where supply is elastic. Maybe farmers can easily just switch their fields over to growing something else. The price only falls a little bit. But now look at the bottom graph, where supply is inelastic. Coffee trees take years to grow. You can't just change what you're doing overnight. That same drop in demand causes the price to absolutely plummet, because farmers are desperate to sell the beans they already grew.
You know, we all just lived through a perfect real-world masterclass in elasticity during the pandemic. Demand for super specialized things like ventilators and N95 masks just exploded. But their supply was incredibly inelastic. You can't just snap your fingers and build a new ventilator factory. The result? Insane price increases and painful shortages. But at the same time, demand also surged for things like cloth masks and hand sanitizer. Their supply, though, was very elastic. Tons of clothing companies and alcohol distilleries were able to pivot and start making them. The result? Prices went up, sure, but not nearly as much. And eventually, the supply caught up.
So let's bring it all home. Price controls seem like simple policies, right? They're meant to protect people, but they have these complex and often unintended side effects, like shortages and surpluses. The real question is, how bad are those consequences going to be? Are we talking about a minor hiccup in the market or a full-blown crisis? The crucial point, the main takeaway, is that the answer almost always depends on elasticity. And once you grasp that, you've taken a huge step toward really, truly thinking like an economist.